The room was cold that morning, and not because of the air conditioning. The numbers on the screen had stopped shifting. For 3 weeks, the system kept flashing warnings: shipments going to the wrong clients, inventory records not matching, delayed returns turning into fines. But now, everything held steady. The dashboard finally showed a full, clear line. For the first time since the breach, the operation was clean. My name is Calla Brent. I am 46 years old. Until that morning, I was senior lead for risk operations at Norwell Supply. I had been there 11 years. I began in logistics support and worked my way into the back-end process control team, rewriting procedures no one else dared to touch. When they gave me authority over risk protocols, I knew more about our systems than the directors who signed them off. The breach started quietly, just client complaints that seemed unrelated. Wrong items, confusing return updates, packages showing as delivered but never processed. Others would have blamed the warehouse. But I saw the pattern. A broken assumption in our system's routing logic had gone untouched for nearly 2 years. It treated all clients the same, even those with unique delivery terms. That one flaw had already cost us millions. Left unchecked, it could have reached 30 million. So I stayed after hours. I built the new logic by hand. I tested it for 10 nights in a separate copy of the system, adjusting how we verified each order. Then I installed it into the live platform in parts, without ceremony, without approval, because no one else knew what to do. I did not document anything formally. There was no time. But by Monday morning, the problem stopped. The executive report called it a miraculous turnaround. The directors celebrated, and then, without warning, the company removed me. The message came at 9:48 in the morning. My access would be cut off by noon. There was no call, no direct meeting, just a mass email from human resources. The reason: lack of collaboration and unwillingness to support shared learning. I knew exactly where that came from. It was the same phrase my director used 3 days earlier, when I refused to put my name on a report I did not write. His name was Elijah Kerr. He had joined 6 months earlier, replacing the former director after an internal restructuring. He had never worked on back-end recovery systems before, but after seeing the numbers improve, he wanted the credit. So he drafted a report with his junior team, claiming the recovery as a group effort. He asked me to approve it for the sake of morale. I told him I needed time to verify every claim. I did not approve the report, and now I was no longer with the company. If you're still here, maybe on your lunch break, maybe walking out like I just did, leave a trace. Just tell me where you're listening from. And if this feels close to home, subscribe. You'll want to hear how this ends. Because what Elijah never considered was the timing. The fixes I installed were not permanent. They required updates. I had programmed them to reset unless verified weekly. That last verification had already passed, and in their rush to remove me, no one asked for a handover. Not one person requested an explanation. They thought they could keep the system running by simply leaving it alone. But what they left was a process built on conditions they could not see, and it was already beginning to shift. The moment I logged out of the system, I remembered how I had left it, not broken, just waiting. In that final patch I installed, I had locked the logic to a schedule. Every 7 days, the validation keys had to be refreshed, not as a trap, as a safety. I had designed it to ensure that if anyone made changes, the system would verify the new logic before letting it run. But I had been the one refreshing those keys, and now there was no one in that chair. I did not build it to punish anyone. I built it because I had seen what happened when old processes lingered unchecked. In the breach we had just escaped, that was exactly how the losses spread. Rules left too long, assumptions never questioned. That was what nearly cost them $30 million. So I made the system require questions. I made it ask for answers, and I had made it forget those answers on a timer, unless someone gave it new ones. That Monday, no one did. They had stripped my name from the system registry, reassigned my credentials, forwarded my emails, but they had not asked how the rules worked, not even once. I had not been invited to a single handover call. I was not asked to document anything. They assumed the logic would hold because the screen was green. They saw stability. What they were looking at was momentum, and momentum ends. By Tuesday evening, one of the automatic updates I had set up triggered a check on our oldest client contracts. Those contracts included custom fulfillment clauses, some based on volume, some on delivery timeframes, some on refund thresholds. The system was programmed to recheck those terms every quarter, but the parser I built required confirmation from an internal reviewer, me. Without it, the terms reset to base level, standard rules, generic clients. So the system ran what it thought were updates, and it downgraded every premium agreement to basic settings. I did not know it had happened. Not yet. I had no access, no alerts, but I could imagine the first call. Somewhere in the company, a client service rep would be answering a call from someone furious, a longtime customer, a partner who had spent years building trust. And now, their priority shipments were stalled, their return policies rejected, their tracking no longer available. They would be asked to submit a ticket. They would be told it was a temporary delay. But the damage would not feel temporary to them. Elijah would not hear about it right away. The early noise would go to support, then operations, then the analysts who now owned the team success story. They would look at each other and not understand why the system was changing answers it had already confirmed, because I had never written down the flow. I had shown it. I had trained them by walking through it, live, on screen, in response to live cases. No one had recorded it. No one had asked to. And now the fixes were fading. They had always been built to fade, like chalk on a whiteboard, designed to disappear unless someone remembered what was written. I had been the person who remembered, and the person who had been erased. By Wednesday, the 7th day would come, and the system would ask again, "Who verifies the rules?" There would be no answer. By the time the 7th day came, I had already opened my notebook. Not the one from work, not the one they asked me to hand in when I left. This one was older, personal. It had no system credentials, just drawings, diagrams, sequences, notes from months of sitting alone in a quiet room with too many screens. I had always worked with paper when the logic felt too large for the keyboard. The systems I built were never just code. They were movement, cause and echo, change and recalibration. And in that notebook on page 26 was a schedule, a clean loop of verification routines, not for the whole platform, just for the critical layer, the rules that determined which clients received which level of response. The layer most teams ignored because it rarely failed, because I had designed it not to. But I had also designed it to ask for a human pulse. Once every 7 days, the core logic sent out a silent request, verify or reset. If no one verified, the process did not break. It reverted. That reversion had begun the moment I lost access. I did not monitor the system after I was removed. I no longer had permission. But I knew exactly when the change would take effect. I had programmed it to rotate at 2:15 on the 8th day. My own quiet version of a clock striking midnight. At that moment, every exception rule I had added would clear itself, not out of spite, not for sabotage, because temporary rules must expire unless someone proves they are still needed. I had been the one proving them, and now the system was operating on default assumptions. It treated every client as average, every response as equal. It canceled priority pathways, rerouted exceptions into standard queues, and silenced alerts meant only for high-risk accounts. On the surface, the platform still looked clean. There were no errors, no crashes. But the trust, the part no one could measure on a screen, was already cracking. I had left nothing illegal behind, no backdoors, no corrupt files, just design. Design that responded to neglect the same way a garden does. Stop tending and it will not explode. It will return to dirt. The people inside the company would not see it yet. To them, the week had gone smoothly. Elijah would still be walking into meetings with confidence. His team would be forwarding small issues to junior tech support. They would not connect the rising volume of confusion with anything I had built, because I had not put my name on anything. But the names would appear elsewhere: client dashboards, support tickets, contract emails, all asking the same question in different forms. Why are we being treated like new customers? The answer was simple. The system no longer remembered who they were because I was the one who remembered, and that memory had a timer. The first shift appeared as a question. It came from one of our older accounts, a logistics client who had relied on us for fast-cycle product returns. His message was brief, almost routine. He asked whether their return authorizations now required manual clearance. That phrasing meant something had moved. something small enough to slip past operations, but sharp enough to catch the eye of someone used to watching the flow. That contract had never been static. Its rules evolved through performance. If their order accuracy remained above a certain range for 3 full months, the platform adjusted their return policy automatically. No one called it a privilege, but that is what it became. I had written those rules to listen, not to control. The logic waited for patterns, then adapted quietly in response. Each of those adjustments depended on an internal checkpoint. I reviewed their data every 30 days, confirmed their consistency, and reset the marker. That verification was not a job requirement. It was a habit. I had watched their trends long enough to know which delays mattered and which did not. The platform could process data. I tracked behavior. Since I left, the marker had expired. The contract reverted to baseline terms, and the client noticed the difference. Not through a system alert, but through the time it now took to complete what had once been instant. That lag did not trigger errors. It triggered memory. On their end, things felt slower. On our end, things looked normal. 2 days later, another client flagged an issue with their monthly performance report. Their summary had always arrived on the first weekday of every cycle. It aligned with a priority filter I maintained based on shipment density, not calendar dates. That filter was never automated. It required me to observe how fast their orders moved and how often their status shifted within peak windows. I reset the flag by hand each quarter. That flag was now inactive. The silence that followed was familiar. Inside the company, nothing was wrong. The numbers still aligned. The system still generated output. But outside, people were beginning to measure us differently. Not by what failed, but by what no longer responded the way it used to. The value had not disappeared. It had become slower. And slow in logistics becomes doubt. These were not bugs. They were gaps, not broken functions, just missing responses. Each one traced back to a rule built for motion. And motion requires memory. I had carried that memory every week, every month, every quarter. Now the clients were asking the questions I used to anticipate before they formed, and the system was listening with a blank page. The first report I saw was sent to someone else. It was a standard operational dashboard, productivity scores, fulfillment timelines, return resolutions. The numbers had not collapsed, but the rhythm was off. Resolution time was up by 3%. Response cycles showed a lag across 2 high-volume accounts. On paper, these were acceptable deviations. Inside the logic, they meant the system had stopped adjusting. The platform had not stalled, it had settled. Once the rules reverted to default, every reactive thread I had built froze in place. Triggers that once adapted by the hour now moved by the day. Clients with custom pathways were rerouted through universal checkpoints. The flow became linear again, less responsive, less forgiving. It did not crash, it thickened, and thickened systems do not raise alarms. They create silence, the kind that fills gaps where trust used to live. In one team meeting summary I managed to read, a manager noted that client satisfaction metrics remain within tolerance. That phrasing explained everything. The numbers had narrowed, satisfaction was being measured against a system that no longer moved with the client. It moved with itself. And when platforms begin measuring themselves, the people they serve begin looking elsewhere. Behind that sentence, I heard the quiet urgency of someone who noticed the tension but could not name it. They had seen a slowdown but had no language for cause. They would tell themselves it was the season. They would ask if volume was higher than expected. They would add buffer time to their forecasts, unaware that the system was no longer forecasting anything at all. The issue spread slowly, not as a wave, but as a drift. A data sync failed overnight and took 9 hours to refresh. A billing report missed its automated deadline, not by error, but because a scheduling trigger had aged past its active period. The automation was still running. The logic that shaped it was gone. An internal group flagged a queue where return requests had stacked unusually high. They created a task force. They labeled it a minor backlog. They did not ask whether the backlog had a shape, a slope, or a time signature that resembled anything they had seen before, because the people interpreting those curves were no longer in the room. The chart still moved, but their movement no longer carried meaning. A dip in one column was paired with a rise in another, and the result flattened into nothing. Metrics that once signaled urgency now mimicked symmetry. The illusion of balance returned, but systems do not balance by accident. They do so by removing variance, and variance in a service business is the voice of the people using it. Those voices were still active, but they no longer had a way in. I imagined Elijah reading those reports. He would see patterns of stability. He would hear reassurance from his direct reports, who now repeated phrases like within target and no critical issues. He would scan graphs that showed smooth slopes and consider it a result of better training. He would not wonder what had gone missing. He would not look for movement inside the stillness. The absence of noise would appear to him as control. But stillness only impresses those who do not measure breath. The system I built had been designed to track tension, not conflict, not error, just the tightening and loosening of response. Every input had a shadow. Every adjustment had a counterbalance. I used to listen for them. I used to follow the way one value leaned into another. But the new team had stopped listening, not out of arrogance, out of unfamiliarity. They did not know which parts required interpretation. They read the values as fixed. They treated the model as resolved, and slowly, the model stopped reaching out. There was a time when the platform signaled change in soft increments, 3-second delays here, 2-point offsets there. I had learned to read those as intent. The system wanted something. It asked through friction. Now it had grown quiet. Not idle, just quiet. Like a machine waiting for hands that no longer touch it. It still processed. It still logged. It still answered. But the answers had lost weight. The questions no longer evolved. I did not smile when I saw it. I did not enjoy watching them miss what had once been instinct. I only recognized the drift. The line was still moving, but it no longer knew why. The first escalation did not sound like a warning. It came in the form of a forwarded message. A client service representative had copied a note from an account lead who asked why their delivery update no longer reflected priority routing. The wording was polite, but every sentence carried history. That client had held a fast-track flag on their file since the second quarter of last year. That flag had been recalibrated every month based on fulfillment velocity and contract tier. Without that recalibration, the flag expired, and now, so had the service they had come to expect. Another note followed from a different region. This time, the question pointed to reporting frequency. A client whose dashboard had been updated every Monday now received data only on Wednesdays. Their analytics team had built internal processes around that cadence. It was never promised on paper. It had been delivered through consistency. That consistency had been managed by a condition I adjusted quietly in the back end every 7th day. The condition was no longer active. Their expectations remained. Inside the company, the responses were procedural. Tickets were opened, tags were assigned, task lists filled with phrases like investigate delay and confirm baseline. These were the right words for normal issues, but the pattern unfolding did not follow normal timelines. It did not trigger known alerts. It followed the slope of something deeper, something no one had mapped in years. The support team measured symptoms. They did not see the curve. Elijah scheduled a cross-functional review. The invite list was broad. The meeting title was neutral. There was no crisis declared, only a request for visibility. During that meeting, someone from compliance asked whether the contract conditions had shifted. Someone from analytics replied that the terms appeared unchanged. They had matched the templates. They had verified the documentation. No one asked whether the logic behind the terms had been time-bound. No one asked who had kept that time. The drift became language. Clients began phrasing their questions differently. They stopped asking if a function had failed. They started asking whether something had changed. The difference mattered. They were no longer reacting to mistakes. They were responding to absence. Reports that used to arrive early were now simply on time. Shipments that used to move through priority lanes now arrived with standard handling. Refunds that once processed within hours now resolved within days. These were not service breakdowns. They were memory gaps. The system had forgotten the reasons behind its own exceptions, and the people inside had not noticed what it used to remember. I had seen this once before. Years ago, in a smaller company that tried to scale too fast. Their systems grew faster than their people. The logic outpaced the understanding, and when the system changed shape, no one knew how to speak its old language. That silence had not come from a crash. It had come from comfort. Everyone assumed stability meant health, until the silence grew too consistent, until the clients started sounding like auditors, and the company realized it had stopped learning how to hear. The message arrived on a Wednesday. It was short. No greeting, no subject, just a single line inside the body. Can you come in for a quick overview? The sender was Elijah. His name appeared without title. The timestamp was 7:43 in the morning. That choice mattered. It came before the rest of the team would see their inbox. It came before he could be seen asking for help. I read it twice before closing the window. The tone was not urgent, but the timing was. Systems do not degrade in a straight line. They unravel through accumulation. The requests from clients had shifted from curiosity to concern. Internal teams began repeating themselves across channels. A second meeting had been scheduled with the same participants and the same questions. This time, no one offered a new answer. The logic had turned circular, and inside that loop, someone had remembered who used to break the pattern. The phrasing of Elijah's message was deliberate. Quick overview suggested a reset, a summary, not a repair. It asked for presence without accountability. It extended familiarity without apology. It invited me into the room without naming what had changed. That structure revealed everything. The systems had started to drift beyond recovery, and the man who removed me now needed the map I had never drawn. I opened my notebook later that afternoon, not to respond, just to check. I had built layers into every process I touched. Most of those layers required renewal by verification. The longest lasting had a 90-day window. I counted forward from my last interaction. The system was nearing the edge of that cycle. One more week and the last of the logic I had embedded would turn dormant. Not fail, just fall silent. The platform would still function, but it would no longer recognize the difference between friction and resistance. That distinction had defined the way I worked. Friction meant tension that required attention. Resistance meant thresholds were being crossed. When the system stopped differentiating between them, it stopped learning. From the outside, that loss appeared as stability. On the inside, it hardened, and hardened systems resist adaptation. I did not reply to Elijah. I did not forward the message. I did not mention it to anyone. But I did review the access logs. My name no longer existed in the permissions registry. The recovery keys I had generated were inactive. The accounts had cycled through without my credentials. No one had restored my place inside the system. They had only noticed the absence after everything had slowed. That evening, I passed by the office building. I did not enter. The windows were lit. I recognized the meeting room on the 3rd floor. I had led sessions in that room during the first breach. The chairs were still arranged the same way. I could see the reflection of a screen, full of graphs, steady lines, silent curves. From the sidewalk, it all looked fine. But from inside the system, the questions had already stopped evolving, and that silence was beginning to settle in a way no one could interpret. At least, no one still inside. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday. The invitation came from the Chief Operations Officer, but the agenda bore the name of Grant Halden. His involvement marked a shift. He rarely joined internal performance reviews. When he did, the message was always the same: this has gone far enough. The list of attendees was short. No department heads, just Elijah, 2 members from the data team, and a legal advisor. The location had been moved to a small conference room, the kind used when optics mattered less than outcomes. Grant Halden arrived 10 minutes early. He carried no laptop, only a folded piece of paper in one hand and a pen in the other. He placed the paper on the table without unfolding it. Elijah began with a projection of weekly metrics: delivery times, resolution cycles, reporting frequency. The graphs looked stable, the numbers fell within target. He spoke clearly, referencing internal benchmarks, citing external comparisons. He used the phrase "fully manageable" twice. Grant remained quiet. When Elijah finished, Grant asked one question. He did not ask for more data. He asked who had authored the exception framework. Elijah named a team. Grant asked again, this time using the word "designed." The analyst sitting closest to the screen opened a folder, paused, and then said my name. Grant nodded once. He unfolded the paper. It was a sequence of client communications, printed in order, each referencing a shift in service behavior. No one had flagged these as failures. None had triggered alerts, but every one of them pointed to changes the system no longer explained. He asked when I had last interacted with the platform. The analyst checked the logs, the final update connected to my credentials. The date sat just beyond the 80-day threshold. The last rule I had verified had fallen out of cycle. The system no longer applied any active human input to its adaptive layers. It still moved, but it no longer differentiated between users. It no longer recalculated based on behavior. The platform was running on static instruction. Grant walked to the glass wall. He stood with his hands behind his back and watched the street 3 floors below. For a while, no one filled the silence. Then he turned and asked if the archive structure could be restored. The analyst explained that the system required pattern recognition to revalidate. The logic could not be pasted back in. It needed to be reactivated by the same sequence of behaviors it was trained to trust. Those sequences had not been documented. They had been repeated, observed, adjusted, lived. Elijah remained still. He asked whether the logic could be copied and manually reintegrated. The analyst answered carefully. He said the conditions were non-transferable. The structure had been built with rotating time signatures, each rule refreshing based on usage, not timestamps. Once archived, those rules remained visible, but inert. They could not respond to new input unless mirrored by the original cadence. The cadence was not stored in any file. It had existed inside someone who no longer had access. Grant returned to his chair. He folded the paper again. He did not write anything down. He looked at Elijah, then at the analyst, then toward the door. He asked one final question. Had anyone reached out to me? No one answered. The question did not repeat. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. No decisions were recorded, no actions assigned, but outside that room something had shifted. 3 weeks passed without another message. I watched the calendar move quietly toward the 90-day mark. That date mattered. It was the point when the last active layer of verification would archive itself fully. After that, the logic inside the platform would remain readable but inert. It would reflect what I had built, but it would no longer act like it remembered me. Norwell's system would become a diagram without tension, symmetrical, safe, and unresponsive. I had already moved the notebooks into storage. The patterns I used no longer required print. I had transferred the architecture into a platform of my own, rebuilt from first principle. The rules still listened, but this time they asked different questions. The new system did not reward volume, it recognized pace. It did not assume that consistency meant loyalty. It watched for drift, not in data, but in decision. I launched it as a private model under a consultancy name no one traced back to Norwell. The first client came from an industry I had never worked in. They handled high-frequency inventory for hospitality chains, orders placed on instinct, adjusted mid-route, often canceled without notice. They were not looking for a dashboard. They were looking for a way to read fluctuation without calling it error. I gave them something that moved with breath. After 1 week, they asked how many people were on my team. I told them it was a rotating structure. That was not a lie. A month later, I received a message through a third party. A vendor had recommended my system to an account still tied to Norwell's old architecture. The vendor had not known I was the architect of that previous system. The account accepted the offer without conditions. When I reviewed the integration history, I saw a familiar pattern. The exception rules had been flattened. The behavior flags no longer updated. The platform they were leaving still worked, but it no longer worked with them. I signed the contract at 2:14 in the afternoon. That was the same hour I had deployed the last patch into Norwell's core. The symmetry was not intentional, but I noted it anyway. 2 quarters later, Norwell shifted their positioning. Their public materials moved away from claims of adaptive logistics. They spoke instead of resilience. That word meant less movement, less adjustment, less listening. I understood the choice. It reflected what they had become. I never contacted Elijah again. I never replied to Grant's inquiry. There were no memos, no postmortems, no blog posts. I had not left quietly. I had left precisely. And what remained inside the old system was not mine to take back. It had reverted to stillness because it had outlived the rhythm that created it. That stillness was now theirs to maintain. My work continued elsewhere. The systems were smaller, but they responded. The clients did not ask for dashboards. They asked for behavior. I gave them models that shifted shape depending on how they were approached. They did not copy what I had done before. They became the reason I never needed to return.